For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for more updates.
Did you know that India joined with France to launch the International Solar Alliance, which seeks to promote the application of solar technologies all over the world, including the global south? Did you know that for 86 days this year, global temperatures were above the ceiling of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels? Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I am your host, Anil Padmanabhan. Beginning today, the global high table to battle climate change, the Conference of Parties, or COP as we know it, will converge in Dubai here today. The run-up to the meetings have been extremely inclement. Geopolitics is on the edge, the global economy is still in doldrums, and regional wars are spreading. This intersection of climate and geopolitics has given space to diplomacy. Some have even given it a moniker. They call it climate diplomacy. In fact, climate diplomacy has allowed India to reinvent its climate persona, giving it much desired space to engage in global negotiations to facilitate its own carbon-friendly transition. The question is whether India can combine with other countries to pull a rabbit out of the hat, as it were. To answer this and more, we spoke to Constantino Xavier. He's a fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, or CSEP. Constantino recently published a compilation of papers which capture the evolving contours of India's climate diplomacy. I began by asking Constantino to explain as to why and how climate diplomacy has gained such global prominence.
Yeah, I think the best example of climate diplomacy is the organizations, divisions that various governments are creating to deal with climate internationally. So we, of course, know of various ministries in different governments in different countries on renewable energies, science and technology, infrastructure that are all engaged in the climate transition at home. But if you look at the number of institutions that exist today in different countries that are dealing also with the external dimension of the climate transition, it has gone up significantly. This means that you now have dedicated special envoys for climate change who attend international summits, including the Conference of Parties under the UN framework, and represent their respective leaders at those negotiations. You have special envoys also at the ministry level. Several ministries of foreign affairs who generally have not dealt so much with climate environmental issues now have also their special envoys. They have created their special divisions within the ministries that have technical experts from other ministries dealing with a variety of climate transition dimensions. So if you look at that, you see clear indications that domestically governments realize that they will not achieve their transition unless they were very well prepared to operate abroad and negotiate the terms of this climate transition over the next decades abroad.
So which means that there is rather, an alignment between domestic objectives and international commitments because of the emergence of climate diplomacy.
Yeah, I mean, climate essentially, Anil, is of course a common good, a planetary good and a planetary objective for humanity. So we could be speaking also about health, for example. It's a transnational issue, and we saw that in the pandemic, how different governments were cooperating, competing, conflicting around vaccines, PPEs, and the response to the virus. But as in other issues, in climate, which is probably the most pressing issue for the planet and for the future of humanity, there will only be a solution if it is a collective solution that is embodied formally since 1992 in the Rio Earth Conference in Brazil, and over the last 30 years now has manifested exactly in this interface that you cannot just do your transition at home, go green, decarbonize, phase out dirty fuels, nor can you just operate abroad and do nice commitments and negotiate that transition with other countries without doing it at home. So, as in so many other issues, this is a deeply political and diplomatic issue because, as we know in the world, countries don't like to trust each other. There's the game of what we call the prisoner's dilemma of who opts out of commitments secretly or not secretly. Can countries trust each other's reporting, and can they verify the commitments they have made, whether they've actually translated into actions? These are all trust issues, and therefore it is a deeply political issue that needs to be built cooperatively through institutions, and therefore the importance of diplomacy to achieve those instruments, those organizations where you can elevate trust, where you can develop reporting and verification mechanisms, where you can also maybe allot common resources in terms of capital and knowledge to develop solutions. There are many solutions that we are still searching for to accelerate climate action. And that commitment has to come from countries, and if you want to depute resources and experts abroad or mutually invest in each other's countries to find those solutions cooperatively.
So, Constantino, how has India fared in this regard? Because for several reasons. One, it has a lot to lose from climate change, and it has also a lot to gain by implementing strategies to green the economy.
I think the Indian position has changed as all countries have changed their positions over the last few decades. It has changed over the last few years significantly after the Paris Conference of Parties and the Paris Agreement in 2015, which is the most robust agreement of nationally determined contributions where countries make voluntary commitments to go green, if you want, in a very broad term, and transit their economies towards greener objectives. In the case of India, that is a 2030 voluntary objective that the Prime Minister announced at Paris. And then you have the 2070 net zero ambition that India has declared. But to achieve that, you have a variety of steps that have been taken. And I think what has significantly changed in the Indian position, which is one of the propositions that I made together with Kartik Nachiappan in the recent report that we published by the Center for Social and Economic Progress, is that India's position, in terms of the visibility, the perception has changed from what used to be called and seen fairly or unfairly as a naysayer, as a negative obstructionist actor in climate negotiations, a country that was reluctant about making commitments, a country that saw climate and growth, or development in particular in the case of India, as incompatible. That has shifted progressively over the last few two decades, and particularly the last few years, towards an India that is a much more affirmative, positive player, a country that sees opportunities in the climate transition, that sees climate and development as being compatible in that sense, or basically you can have green growth in India. Of course, the speed at which that can be done, the ways in which this can be done, India has its own views, which in some ways align, in other ways are different from the global north, developed, industrialized countries. But at least now you have the space to have that negotiation towards solutions.
Interesting. So what you're saying is that India has pivoted from being part of the problem to be part of the solution, right?
For global north countries, that I think is right. That is a perspective. If you talk to diplomats today from the US, from Sweden, or from Germany, or even from Japan, they traditionally saw India exactly as a naysayer, as an obstructionist country in reaching agreements. In fact, you and I remember that also sometimes India took that positively. It was It was happy to obstruct agreements. But it's also important to question what agreements were being proposed. These were heavily global north aligned agreements. This was and still is much more of a priority, the green transition in the global north than it's in the global south, where you still have a large percentage of the populations below the poverty line. And I think shifting that has now opened up a very different posture on both sides. In the global north, as India is a land of opportunity to scale up, incubate innovations that are climate-centric and also development-sensitive. And within the global south, in India in particular, that openness saying, we are here now to find solutions that can compatibilize climate and growth at the same time. Not only for us, by the way, here in India, but for the larger developing countries that are still, if you want, industrializing and carbonizing, not decarbonizing, right? So that are still growing, industrializing, and therefore have a natural socioeconomic priority to deliver growth and development to their populations.
Constantino is making a very interesting point here. What he's saying is that India has gone from being part of the problem to being part of the solution. I was curious to know as to why and how this pivot happened, whether it is due to the fact that with the growth of the Indian economy, it has acquired the capability to offer something at the negotiations.
Yeah, absolutely. Anil, forgive me for being a realist, but capabilities and power are what matters, right? And the more enmeshed and entangled you are, because the economy today is that, you cannot grow an economy without trading, investing abroad, and receiving investments. The more you're plugged in that system, and the bigger your share is of that pie of the global economy, the more pragmatic you will naturally be, because you will have to find solutions, and others will also look at you and be much more willing to concede and to give in to your position. So yes, beyond, of course, different approaches, I think also stances, and those do matter, I have to say. The way you position yourself, the way you declare an ambition, the way you're saying that 2047 you want to be a developed country, right, which is now India's declared ambition. That matters and is very important. And that is also noticed. And these things, these are immaterial declarations, ambitions, and body languages and vocabulary, but they matter. But beyond all that, it is the growth of India's economy that has shifted India's position and has shifted the attitude of other countries towards India. And in the case of climate, that means today, if you see a country that has taken over 400 million people out of poverty over the last 20 years, if you see a country that is more open than ever to investments, then India that has today the largest share ever in its trading with the world, has never traded more with the world, then naturally for the rest of the countries, there's also in the global north, say the US, Europe again, Japan, Australia, that are also signing different types of trade agreements with India now. They're much more willing to also concede maybe on the climate side of things. Now, that's, of course, a dance, a game of bargaining, because what is very important, say, for, let's say, an European Union trade negotiator, which is very strong climate-centric clauses to trade investments, is not as important for India. So that will require, therefore, political buy-in from both sides and saying we will, on the case of the EU, maybe dilute some of these standards. In the case of India, saying we will join the table of negotiations and join some of these standards of what is green or not.
India's boldness at the global high table is manifesting itself in its ability to create new institutions to negotiate carbon transition tracks. One good example of this is the creation of the International Solar Alliance.
I think it's a very recent development, the one you mentioned of India as being front-footed, at least willing to be part of negotiations and discussions. As I mentioned in my previous answer, it's going to get ugly in some ways. And diplomatic is, of course, a nice word, climate diplomacy, but this is also really about climate politics and climate geopolitics, right? I mean, we see in Europe, in highly industrialized countries now, people giving up their cars to buy bicycles. That is unthinkable in the global south, right? Particularly here in India, if you look left and right, where we're going to see a massive acquisition of vehicles, personal vehicles. So There's completely different paradigms, and it's going to be very political. But to the point of what you're saying of what we call India's institutional innovations, an India that is now open to also find solutions that are climate-centric. Some of them are technical, solar microgrids, renewable energies, but some of these innovations are beyond the scientific and technological and economic domain. They're also diplomatic innovations. You mentioned the International Solar Alliance, which is focused on solar as one of the renewable energies that can be deployed in India and abroad. There are over 100 countries that are member states of the International Solar Alliance, which is headquartered here in India. That was an announcement made by India and France together. It's also it's an alliance that is not only looking at India. In fact, it's an alliance for the world. It happens to be headquartered and supported by India, but its mandate is to develop solar energy that is affordable, scalable for all global South countries. That could be in South America and Africa and Southeast Asia, countries that are looking for these developmentally sustainable solutions to develop clean energy solutions. Another such institutional innovation in the diplomatic space is the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, CDRI, that also is an Indian innovation that is maybe less focused on the mitigation side, as I say, more on the adaptation side, which is the realization that many developing countries are massively expanding infrastructure, whether it is ports, bridges, roads, civil construction in cities and urbanization, and needs to have infrastructure that has certain standards that are resilient to natural disasters, cyclones, the rise in sea levels, flooding, etc. So India is also taking a very strong position on that, saying we will find solutions cooperatively with other countries to develop our infrastructure in line with the future needs of a rapidly changing climate of the next few decades.
India is adding heft to its climate diplomacy by seeking to be the voice of the global South, even while it continues to play hardball with the North.
I think there's a huge window of opportunity. Let me explain briefly why India has identified and I think been very timely in positioning itself the way you mentioned as a bridge or as a global climate player. See, what we had in 2000s was the basic countries: Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. They're all rapidly rising economies, and they were all positioned themselves to join as a club and negotiate as a bloc, almost against, if you want, the global North and their climate commitments and pressures in the late 2000s, including on the Kyoto Protocol of 2007. And now that basic bloc has collapsed today. China today is more of a global North country than it's a global South country. It is less interested in the UN framework. It is, in terms of its emissions, well above anyone in the global South, closer, in fact, beyond even US emissions in many regards. So in that sense, China has pivoted into a different direction. And the global North, say the US and Europe today, are deeply preoccupied and less capable at home with their own transition. We see the pressures of the Ukraine war and now the crisis between Israel and Palestine. We see the OECD countries unable to commit the financial capital that they had promised post-2015. Every year they have fallen short, so the money is not coming to support other countries. So India in itself has positioned itself as that bridge, and as a voice is one way to put it, but in many ways as a facilitator, I would say, as a bridge and as an incubator, maybe, an innovator to find climate-centric solutions that are in line with the developmental priorities of least developed and middle income countries that are in the global South, but beyond geography are countries that are spread around the world and share the same sensitivities and concerns and political concerns also that India has.
In the final analysis, it is clear that a divided world has to come up with an acceptable framework to combat climate change. And for a host of reasons, India finds itself the center of all these conversations. But it is like negotiating a minefield, even while it has to try and preserve its own growth trajectory to ensure that the socio-economic transformation continues. Indeed, it's an acid test for Indian climate diplomacy. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Strat News Global on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please do share your thoughts, ideas and suggestions with us. I'm available on Twitter @Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.